The Clockwork Conspiracy. Generated by StoryWave.ai. Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Leave a story idea in the comments below so we can create it for you.
Chapter 1, The Morning Mechanic. Detroit's heart pulsed to the rhythm of industry, even in the bleakest of times. But for Stephen Poole, the city's vibrant beat had faded into a hollow echo. The morning mist hung low over the streets like a shroud as he stood outside the chalk outline where once lay his beloved Laura Gray. The cobblestone alley, a vein of the city that usually thrummed with life, now lay silent, save for the distant whistle of a factory steam pipe. Stephen's hands clenched at his sides, the brass watch on his wrist, a gift from Laura, glinting dully under the pale streetlights. The city was waking up around him, unaware that for him, everything had changed. Detective Clarence Hawthorne emerged from behind the yellowing police tape, his trench coat billowing slightly in the breeze. His face was as unreadable as the gray skies above. "I told you, Poole, there's nothing more to see here," Hawthorne grumbled, a half-burnt cigarette hanging from his lip. Stephen's gaze was unyielding. "And I told you, Detective, that nothing isn't good enough," Hawthorne snorted. "Look, we've got our hands full with cases that actually have leads. It's likely some love dispute gone sour." "Love dispute?" Stephen's voice hardened. "You're reducing her death to a mere quarrel?" Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "You think you know better than us? You're a grease monkey, Poole, not Sherlock Holmes." With that, the detective ambled away, leaving Stephen in the chilling embrace of the alley. The mechanic's heart raced with a cocktail of grief and fury. Laura deserved more than apathetic shrugs and hasty conclusions. Stephen returned to the garage where he worked, the smell of oil and metal failing to comfort him as it once did. His coworker, Benny, leaned against a car hood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Steve, you look like hell," Benny said, tossing the rag aside. "Feel like it too," Stephen muttered, his eyes distant. Benny sighed, leaning in closer. "You gonna be all right, man?" "No, Benny, I'm not," Stephen replied, his voice hollow. "Because while the whole damn force is content to let her death slip into some cold case file, I'm not." Benny's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Stephen's tone grew firm, "that if justice won't chase this killer, I will." "Steve, this ain't some dime novel. You can't just play detective," Benny warned. "I'm not playing," Stephen snapped. "Someone took her from me, from this world, and I'll tear this city apart brick by brick if that's what it takes to find the truth." Benny shook his head, a mixture of concern and admiration in his eyes. "If you're set on this, you're gonna need help." Stephen looked up, the brass watch on his wrist catching the fluorescent light. "I need information, leads. Someone who's seen things, knows how these streets really work." Benny nodded slowly. "I might know a guy. Old man Kingsley, you know, the retired detective. Some say he's lost his marbles, but maybe he's got a few you could use." Stephen's expression hardened with resolve. "Then that's where I'll start." "Thanks, Benny." As the day wore on and the garage's clamor grew louder, Stephen's mind was elsewhere, traversing the city's shadowy corners in search of answers. With the night came a determination that settled deep in his bones. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The city of Detroit, with its clockwork precision, was about to be disrupted. A mechanic with a cause was on the hunt, and the gears of conspiracy had begun to turn. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Night. Stephen stood in the dim light of his apartment, the silence a stark contrast to the chatter of the factory whistles and car horns outside. He turned Laura's locket over in his hands, the gold surface reflecting the faint light, a small lighthouse in the gloom. It was an ornate thing, not Laura's usual style at all. That's what made it so peculiar, so out of place among her belongings. A soft click resounded as he pried it open. Inside, instead of the expected photograph, was an etching, intricate and unfamiliar, a symbol that seemed to whisper of secrets and hidden depths. It was a circle, enclosed by what looked like mechanical gears, with an eye at the center. Benny's words echoed in Stephen's thoughts. "Symbols like that ain't just doodles, Steve. They mean something. Something bigger than us." Stephen's fingers traced the symbol, the gears and the eye. What could it signify? A group? A belief? It had to be a clue to who was behind Laura's murder, a message or a signature. He needed to find Old Man Kingsley sooner rather than later. The following night, The streets of Detroit were slick with rain, the droplets tapping a Morse code of urgency as Stephen made his way to the Kingsley residence. The old detective's house was a relic, sandwiched between newer buildings like a forgotten bookmark. Kingsley answered the door, his form hunched but his eyes sharp, taking in Stephen with a single glance. "Heard you might be stopping by," he rasped, stepping aside to let Stephen enter. The inside of the house was like stepping into the past, each object a relic with a story. Kingsley gestured to a chair, and Stephen sat, the locket heavy in his pocket. "You got something that needs looking at?" Kingsley prompted, his voice a gravelly hum. Stephen pulled out the locket, laying it on the table between them. "This symbol, inside Laura's locket. You ever seen anything like it?" Kingsley leaned forward, his hazel eyes narrowing. "Where'd you say you got this?" "It was Laura's," Stephen replied, watching the old detective carefully. "Found it at the scene." Kingsley's hand was steady as he picked up the locket, his touch almost reverent. "This here's not common knowledge," he murmured, tapping the symbol. "That's the mark of the machinist's order. Secretive bunch, obsessed with progress, power, control." Stephen's pulse quickened. "An order? Like a secret society?" Kingsley nodded slowly. "Precisely. They've been around since the Industrial Revolution. Some say they're just a myth, a story for the working man. But this," he tapped the locket again, "this is proof they're more than just a fable." Stephen leaned in, his voice low. "And they could be linked to Laura's death?" "Could be," Kingsley agreed, "or it could be a warning. Either way, you've just stepped into a much larger world. Stephen, be careful where you tread." Stephen's resolve hardened. "I need to know more about them." Kingsley sighed, a raspy sound like wind through dry leaves. "I might have a few old case files. Never connected them to a group like this, but there were rumors. I'll see what I can dig up." "Thank you," Stephen said, the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. "I need to understand." Kingsley's gaze held a flicker of something like respect. "You're chasing shadows, Stephen. Just don't get lost in them." Stephen stood, the locket's chain curling around his fingers like a promise. "I won't stop until I find the truth." As he stepped back into the night, the rain had stopped, leaving the world momentarily silent. But the echoes of the day's revelations resonated loudly in Stephen's mind, propelling him forward into the depths of the conspiracy that had entangled his life. The machinist's order was no longer a whisper in the dark. It had become the heartbeat of his quest. Chapter 3: Shadows and Symbols. The neon sign of the gearbox bar flickered erratically, casting an irregular glow over the cracked pavement outside. Stephen hesitated at the threshold, the symbol from Laura's locket burning in his memory. This was the kind of place where shadows congregated, where secrets were currency. He pushed open the door, the heavy scent of tobacco and spilled spirits assaulting his senses. The patrons were a patchwork of Detroit's underbelly factory workers, with grimy hands nursing their drinks, sharp-eyed gamblers, and those who whispered in corners, their conversations as cloaked as their intentions. Stephen slid onto a stool at the bar, catching the bartender's attention. She was a woman of sharp angles with a gaze that cut to the bone. "What's your poison?" she asked, her voice smooth like the whiskey she poured. "Just information," Stephen replied, his eyes scanning the establishment. "I'm looking for someone who knows about this." He produced a sketch of the symbol from Laura's locket. The bartender's eyes flicked to the paper, then away. "Don't know what you're talking about," she said, her tone final. But a man at the end of the bar had turned, his interest piqued. He sauntered over, a smirk playing on his lips. "That's a curious thing to be asking round here," he said, his accent thick with the streets of Detroit. Stephen met his gaze. "I'm curious by nature," the man chuckled. "Well, curiosity can be dangerous, friend, especially in this city." Stephen leaned in, his voice low. "Danger doesn't deter me." "You a cop?" The man's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Do I look like one?" Stephen countered. The man appraised him, shaking his head. "Nah, you got that look like you've got nothing to lose." "I'm looking for answers," Stephen admitted. "Answers tied to this symbol." The bar was suddenly silent, the only sound the hum of the flickering sign outside. Then, from the shadowed booth in the back, a voice cut through the tension. "You're playing with fire, asking about the machinists here." Stephen turned to see a figure emerge, the dim light glinting off a gold pinky ring. The man's presence commanded attention. his stocky build and salt and pepper hair marking him as someone not to be trifled with. "I'm willing to get burned," Stephen replied, his stance firm. The newcomer approached, his green eyes boring into Stephen's. "Then you're either brave or foolish. But either way, you won't find your answers without paying a price." Stephen held the man's gaze. "Name it. You've got guts," the man said, a twisted smile forming. "But guts don't keep you breathing. You need protection if you're going to dive deeper into the Order's business. And you're offering that protection?" Stephen asked, skepticism lacing his tone. "For a price," the man reiterated, his mustache twitching as he considered Stephen. "Information for information. You tell me why you're so interested in the machinists, and I might just keep you from disappearing." Stephen weighed his options. Trusting this man was like dancing on the edge of a blade, but he needed a foothold in this world, some semblance of guidance through the labyrinth. "My girlfriend," Stephen started, "she was killed, and this symbol was with her." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, the machinists don't take kindly to snooping. If you're going after them, you're going to need all the help you can get." He extended his hand. "Name's Vincent, and I think we might be able to help each other, Mr. Poole." Stephen considered the hand before him, each second stretched taut with implications. Finally, he took it, the handshake sealing an uneasy alliance. "Call me Stephen," he said, knowing full well that the shadows of the Gearbox Bar were just the beginning. The underworld of Detroit was vast and unforgiving, but so was his resolve. With a symbol as his guide and danger as his constant companion, Stephen stepped further into the night, the echoes of his newfound alliance trailing behind him like the lingering smoke of a doused flame. Chapter 4. The Brass Watch. The Gearbox Bar had become a distant buzz in Stephen's ears as he walked the damp streets of Detroit, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked concrete. His encounter with Vincent and the other shadowy figures within had left him with more questions than answers. But it was the brass watch on his wrist, still ticking away the seconds, that grounded him. It was a constant reminder of Laura, of the time they had lost, and of the time he had left to uncover the truth. As the evening waned into night, Kingsley's house loomed ahead, its windows casting weak pools of light onto the lawn. Stephen knocked on the door, the sound hollow against the wood. The door creaked open, revealing Kingsley, his expression unreadable. "Heard you stirred up some trouble at the Gearbox," he said, voice raspy. Stephen stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around him. "Word travels fast." Kingsley nodded, leading him to the study, where walls of books stood like silent sentinels. In this city, the walls have ears and the shadows have eyes. Stephen took a seat, the watch on his wrist catching the lamplight. "I might have made an ally in Vincent. He knows about the symbol." "Vincent Moretti is a snake," Kingsley said, his tone cautionary. "But even snakes can lead you to the garden." Stephen exhaled slowly. He said the machinists don't take kindly to snooping. Kingsley's gaze fell on the brass watch. "That watch, Laura gave it to you?" "Yes." Stephen's fingers brushed over the cool metal. "It's all I have left of her." Kingsley leaned back, his eyes distant. "I used to have a watch like that. Gave it to someone special, too." He sighed. "Lost her in a way that wasn't so different from your Laura." Stephen looked up, the connection between them unspoken but palpable. "You think the machinists were involved?" "Could be," Kingsley admitted. "The symbol, it's old, tied to many things, some best left in the past. But they've resurfaced now, and if they're involved, you're up against a giant." Stephen's resolve was unwavering. "Then I'll find a way to bring the giant down." Kingsley's eyes met his, a spark of something like admiration flickering within. "I've been out of the game for a while, but I still know how to play. I'll help you." "Thank you, Albert," Stephen said, the use of Kingsley's first name marking the cementing of their alliance. Kingsley pulled a worn leather notebook from a drawer. "I've kept tabs on things, people, places. We'll need to be smart, careful. The machinists have their hands in pockets all over Detroit." Stephen nodded, his mind racing with the enormity of the task ahead. "We start at the beginning. Find the link between Laura and the machinists." Kingsley handed him the notebook. "This is a list of names, some you might recognize from the bar. They may not all be machinists, but they're connected, one way or another." As the night deepened, the two men pored over the notebook, their whispered strategies blending with the ticking of the brass watch, a metronome for their burgeoning plan. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but Stephen was no longer walking it alone. With Kingsley at his side and Laura's memory as his guiding light, he stepped further into the labyrinth, the watch on his wrist a silent testament to the time that was slipping away and to the resolve that held steadfast within him. Chapter 5. The Coded Message. In the sequestered confines of Kingsley's den, the air was thick with the musk of aging paper and the sharp tang of black coffee. Albert Kingsley, with his weathered hands and sharp intellect, pored over the contents of Laura's locket alongside Stephen, whose mechanical aptitude proved surprisingly adept at unraveling puzzles not so different from the innards of a stubborn engine. Kingsley hummed, his fingers tracing the intricate symbol within the locket. If we're right about this being a cipher, each gear tooth could correspond to a letter in the alphabet. Stephen leaned closer, his eyes scrutinizing the symbol's every intricately etched detail. 26 teeth, he noted, his mind whirring like the gears he was so familiar with. It lines up with the number of letters. Kingsley's eyebrow arched in approval. Let's start with the basics then. A rotation cipher, perhaps. They set to work, the only sounds in the room, the scratch of pen on paper, and the occasional clink of a coffee cup set back on its saucer. Hours melded into one another as they tested hypothesis after hypothesis, the thrill of the chase momentarily dulling the ache of loss that brought them together. Finally, with a triumphant slam of his fist on the desk, Kingsley cracked the final rotation. "Got it!" he exclaimed, a triumphant glint in his hazel eyes as he read aloud the decoded message. "Seek Hargrove at the Crimson Cabaret." Stephen's mind raced. Hargrove? That's got to be Gerald Hargrove, the real estate magnate. But what's his connection to the cabaret? Kingsley's brows knit together in thought. It's one of those upscale joints where the city's elite rub shoulders with the underworld. If Hargrove's involved with the machinists, that place could be a front. Stephen stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the wood floor. Then that's where we'll find our answers. The following evening found them outside the opulent facade of the Crimson Cabaret, the muffled sound of jazz seeping through the walls. Stephen and Kingsley entered the establishment, the former's eyes adjusting to the dim lighting, the latter's to the throng of Detroit's glitterati mingling with those whose wealth was of a more clandestine nature. Gerald Hargrove was not hard to find, his boisterous laugh and flamboyant attire making him the center of attention in a room full of peacocks. The businessman's reputation preceded him, a self-made man known for his ruthless business tactics and a penchant for lavish parties. Stephen Poole, Hargrove greeted with a toothy grin, his voice smooth and practiced as he shook Stephen's hand. "What brings a man of your caliber to my humble establishment?" Stephen met his gaze evenly. "Just looking for some entertainment, Gerald, though I hear the real show is behind the scenes." Hargrove's eyes flickered, a brief shadow crossing his face before he recovered. "You've been talking to the right people, it seems." Kingsley, now beside Stephen, interjected with casual finesse. "We're interested in a particular symbol. It's come to our attention, you might be familiar with it." Hargrove's jovial facade faltered for a fraction of a second, his gaze darting momentarily to a discreet tattoo peeking out from beneath his cuff, a gear with an eye at its center. Stephen's pulse quickened, his mechanic's fingers itching for the tools of his trade, as if they could dismantle the man before him and lay bare the secrets he held. But this required a different kind of finesse. "Perhaps we could discuss this further, Gerald, in a place more private?" Stephen suggested, his voice laced with a deceptive lightness. Hargrove sized them up, his initial affability replaced by a cold calculation. "Follow me, gentlemen." As they trailed Hargrove to a secluded back room, the air seemed to thicken with the unspoken tension between them. The businessman had a dark secret, and Stephen, with Kingsley at his side, was determined to drag it into the light. Chapter 6. Red Herring. The back room of the Crimson Cabaret was steeped in shadows, the air thick with the musk of cigar smoke and the underlying scent of aged wood. Gerald Hargrove, clad in a suit that spoke of wealth with every tailored seam, sat across from Stephen and Albert, his normally gregarious demeanor now replaced with an icy reserve. I must admit, your insistence on privacy for such a trifle matter is amusing, Hargrove commented, his fingers tapping a staccato rhythm on the mahogany table. Albert's eyes, sharp and assessing, never wavered from the real estate tycoon. We find nothing trivial in the pursuit of truth, Gerald. Your connection to the machinists is no laughing matter. Hargrove's laughter was a hollow sound, devoid of genuine mirth. The machinists? A fanciful tale spun in the bowels of factories and the dim corners of bars. Stephen leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. We know about the symbol, Gerald. The same one that's barely concealed beneath your cuff. That's no fairy tale. A shadow crossed Hargrove's face, a flicker of unease that he quickly masked with a smirk. Gentlemen, you are barking up the wrong tree. On the night in question, I was attending a gala with several esteemed colleagues. You can verify with them. Albert raised an eyebrow. A convenient alibi, yet it doesn't explain your interest in the symbol. Hargrove sighed, a performance of exasperation. It's merely an affectation, an old family crest, nothing more. The conversation was a dance, a strategic push and pull that Stephen felt in his bones. He watched Hargrove, the way the man's eyes darted to the door, the slight sheen of sweat on his brow despite the room's chill. It's a compelling story you've spun, Gerald, Stephen said, his voice steady. But it's the slip you nearly made earlier that intrigues us more. Hargrove's facade wavered, and Stephen pressed on. You mentioned the docks in passing, a shipment that was none of our concern. What's at the docks, Gerald? For a moment there was silence, save for the distant melody of jazz and the low murmur of conversation beyond the walls. Hargrove's face was a mask of control, but his eyes betrayed the first signs of genuine fear. The docks are a complex web of commerce, gentlemen. I am but one of many who utilize its services. Look into it if you must, but you'll find nothing that ties back to me or your machinists. Albert stood, his movements deliberate. We'll take our leave then. But be aware, Gerald, a web has many strands, and we're quite adept at following them. As they exited the cabaret, the night air was a crisp contrast to the stifling atmosphere they'd left behind. Stephen's mind was alight with possibilities, the businessman's fleeting mention of the docks a beacon in the murk of misdirection. He's hiding something, Albert, Stephen asserted, his breath forming clouds in the cool air. The docks might be our next lead. Albert nodded, his gaze pensive as he looked out at the city's skyline. Yes, but we tread carefully. The docks are no place for the faint of heart or the unprepared. It's a cesspool of illicit dealings and unsavory characters. Stephen's jaw set in determination. Then we prepare. We go in with eyes wide open and watch each other's backs. Albert agreed with a curt nod. And together they walked the streets of Detroit, the city's pulse a steady thrum beneath their feet. The docks awaited, a new chapter in their investigation, promising either the breakthrough they needed or another layer of deception to unravel. But for Stephen, each step was a step closer to avenging Laura, to bringing her justice, and he would follow the trail wherever it led. Chapter 7. A Friend in the Press. The relentless clacking of typewriters filled the air as Stephen and Kingsley entered the bustling newsroom of the Detroit Chronicle. Journalists hunched over their desks, the scent of ink and paper mingling with the faint aroma of stale coffee. Evelyn Carter, auburn hair pinned up in a functional style, looked up from her typewriter as the two men approached, her emerald eyes sharp with intelligence. Stephen, Kingsley, Evelyn greeted, standing to shake their hands. I assume this isn't a social call? No, it's not, Stephen replied. We need access to information that's not easy to come by. We were hoping you could help. Evelyn nodded, her gaze returning to the men with renewed interest. I've heard whispers about your endeavors. What are you looking for? We're retracking a symbol tied to the machinists, Kingsley interjected, his raspy voice low. We believe there's more to their story than mere urban legends. Evelyn's brow furrowed as she pondered their request. I've come across mentions of them in old city records, unsolved cases with strange symbols. I can get you into the archives. Stephen leaned against the desk, his expression one of gratitude. That would be invaluable, Evelyn. We're running out of leads. She offered a small, conspiratorial smile. In this line of work, connections are currency. I have a few that could open doors for you. Kingsley's smile was thin but appreciative. With your help, we might just find the break we need. Evelyn pulled a notepad toward her, scribbling down a few names. These are contacts who've been around long enough to know the city's secrets. They might have heard something useful. Stephen accepted the slip of paper, studying the names. How do you find these people? Persistence and a knack for listening, Evelyn replied, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Information is everywhere, you just have to know how to look. And the archives? Kingsley inquired, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of new evidence. They're extensive and not exactly organized, Evelyn warned as she began to gather her coat and bag, but I'll guide you through them. The trio made their way to a room lined with towering shelves crammed with bound newspapers and dusty files. The archives were a labyrinth of history, each volume a repository of the city's past. As they delved into the stacks, Evelyn's adept hands moved with practiced ease, pulling out editions with potential relevance. Here, she said, handing a bound newspaper to Stephen. Reports of industrial accidents with peculiar circumstances. Might be a good place to start. Hours slipped by as they scoured the archives, the musty smell of paper, their constant companion. The occasional sound of a page turning or a low murmur of conversation punctuated the silence. Stephen looked up from a particularly yellowed paper, his eyes weary but determined. This article from 38 mentions an explosion at a factory. Says here the cause was never determined, but there's this symbol drawn in the margin. Kingsley leaned over the article, his finger tracing the familiar gear and eye. Someone wanted to make sure this wasn't forgotten. It seems we're not the only ones interested in the machinists, Evelyn mused, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and foreboding. The day waned as they continued their investigation, the setting sun casting long shadows across the archive room. With Evelyn's help, Stephen and Kingsley pieced together fragments of information, a picture slowly emerging from the chaos of the past. As they prepared to leave, the weight of the gathered evidence in hand, Evelyn turned to Stephen. I'm invested in this now, too. Count me in for the long haul. Stephen met her gaze, the bond of their shared purpose solidifying. We were glad to have you with us, Evelyn. Together, we'll shed light on this conspiracy. They exited the Chronicle, the city skyline a jagged silhouette against the twilight. With fresh leads and a steadfast ally in Evelyn, their investigation had found new momentum. The machinist's shadowy influence had seeped into the very foundation of Detroit, but Stephen and his allies were determined to unearth every hidden cog in the Clockwork conspiracy. Chapter 8. The Unsuspecting Benefactor. Under the opulent chandeliers of the grand ballroom, Detroit's elite gathered in a symphony of rustling silks and the gentle clink of crystal. The charity event, a mask for deeper, more nefarious exchanges, was the perfect hunting ground for Stephen, Kingsley, and Evelyn as they navigated through the throng of philanthropists with their smiles wide and palms outstretched. Evelyn, her auburn hair styled in an elegant updo that spoke of sophistication, leaned towards Stephen, her voice a hushed whisper amid the orchestral backdrop. That's him, Leonard Shaw. His charitable contributions are as vast as the rumors of his backroom dealings. Stephen's eyes locked onto the target, a man whose sleek silver hair was swept back, his tailored suit a confirmation to his wealth. Shaw's laughter was rich and resonated through the crowd, yet it was the sharpness in his gaze as he surveyed the room that caught Stephen's attention. Kingsley, the lines on his face deepened by the ballroom's soft lighting, nodded subtly. He's got his fingers in many pies, but it's the ones hidden from the public eye that interest us. With a strategy in mind, the trio split up to work the room. Stephen approached Shaw, his manner easy and unassuming. Mr. Shaw, I've admired your work from afar. The way you uplift the community is inspirational. Shaw turned to him, a practiced smile gracing his lips. Ah, Mr. Poole, is it? I believe your reputation as a mechanic precedes you. To what do I owe the pleasure? Stephen matched Shaw's smile with one of his own. I'm considering a foray into philanthropy myself. I was hoping you could provide some insight. A flicker of interest passed through Shaw's eyes. Philanthropy is the cloak that adorns the shoulders of those with the means to wear it. Tell me, what cause has caught your heart? The youth of Detroit, Stephen replied, the lie smooth on his tongue. I believe in investing in the future. Shaw's nod was one of approval. A noble endeavor. Perhaps we could discuss this further over dinner. Elsewhere in the room, Evelyn engaged in conversation with a group of Shaw's associates, her journalist's acumen dissecting their words for any hint of Shaw's less publicized ventures. Kingsley, meanwhile, observed from the sidelines, his detective's intuition picking up on the subtle exchanges of glances that spoke volumes. As the evening progressed, Stephen found himself alone with Shaw in a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Mr. Shaw, I must confess, my interest in philanthropy isn't purely altruistic," Stephen ventured, carefully watching Shaw's reaction. Shaw's demeanor changed, a shrewdness creeping into his eyes. Indeed, it's rare to find such candor at these events. "I'm looking for connections," Stephen continued, the words calculated, the kind that open doors which are typically closed. Shaw's gaze was piercing. "Connections can be expensive." "I'm willing to pay the price," Stephen assured him. "It's not a matter of money," Shaw said, leaning in. "It's a matter of trust, and trust is earned, Mr. Poole." Stephen held Shaw's gaze, the undercurrent of danger thrumming between them. "Then consider this the beginning of a lucrative relationship," he said, extending his hand. Shaw took it, his grip firm. "We shall see, Mr. Poole, we shall see." As the night drew to a close and the crowd thinned, the trio reconvened, their expressions contemplative. "He's clever," that Shaw, Kingsley mused, "but he's hiding something behind that philanthropist facade." Evelyn's eyes were keen as she nodded. "His associates are careful, but they're scared of something, or someone." Stephen's thoughts were a whirlwind of possibilities. "Shaw's our link to the machinists, I'm sure of it. But we need to tread carefully. He's a man with resources and reach." The ballroom, with its grandeur and gaiety, had revealed a veneer of respectability that masked the true nature of Leonard Shaw's dealings. As the trio left the event, the air was filled with an electric charge of anticipation and apprehension. The investigation was deepening, and with Shaw in their sights, they were one step closer to unraveling the Clockwork conspiracy. Chapter 9. Whispers and Wiretaps. The evening enshrouded Detroit in its velvety clasp as Stephen and Evelyn huddled in the shadowed interior of Kingsley's weathered Buick. The dashboard was aglow with the faint orange light of the street lamps outside, casting an amber hue on their clandestine operation. Kingsley, having called in favors, from days draped in a badge and gun, procured the necessary equipment for a wiretap. Now the trio sat, the air thick with the tension of moral ambiguity. Evelyn, her normally poised demeanor betraying a hint of trepidation, turned to Stephen, her voice a murmur barely above the hum of the idling engine. "Are we sure about this, Stephen? Wiretapping, it crosses a line." Stephen's fingers fidgeted with the brass watch, a minute gesture betraying his own inner conflict. "I know," he admitted, his eyes not meeting hers. "But we've hit wall after wall. This might be our only chance to peel back the layers shrouding the machinists." Kingsley chimed in, his raspy voice a gravelly undertone. "We're not the law, but we're seeking justice. Sometimes, to catch a snake, you've got to enter the grass." The target of their operation, a mid-level enforcer known only as Razor, was suspected to be a link to the machinists. His penchant for loose talk made him an ideal candidate for their risky endeavor. Evelyn sighed, her expression hardening with resolve. "All right, but we use what we get to push forward, not to publish. I won't have my name attached to anything that could undermine the case or our credibility." Stephen nodded his agreement, his focus now on the task at hand. "Agreed. Evelyn, you'll keep an ear on the static. Kingsley, you watch for any sign from Razor. I'll place the device." With the plan set, Stephen exited the vehicle, his movements a blend of caution and precision as he made his way to Razor's usual haunt, a rundown bar with neon lights that flickered like the pulse of the city's underbelly. Inside, the scent of stale beer and the sound of billiards served as a backdrop to the murmurs of illicit conversation. Stephen located Razor, his bulky frame hunched over the bar, a drink in hand. With a sleight of hand honed by years of mechanical work, Stephen planted the wiretap beneath the counter, the device as inconspicuous as a shadow in the night. Back in the Buick, the team listened as Razor's voice crackled through the speaker, a symphony of damning evidence interspersed with the static of the wiretap. "He's talking about a shipment," Evelyn whispered, her pen flying across her notepad. "Something big, scheduled for the docks." Kingsley's eyes gleamed with the thrill of the hunt. "That aligns with what we heard from Hargrove. It's all connected." Stephen's mind raced, the puzzle pieces falling into place with each muttered detail from Razor's lips. The machinists were moving something worth the secrecy and the risk. As the night wore on, the whisper of illicit plans solidified into tangible leads. Razor's voice, unaware of its audience, provided them with a map of connections, a web that ensnared the city's dark corners. When they had gathered enough, Kingsley killed the engine, and the Buick sank into the silence of the night. The air was heavy with the weight of their discovery, and the knowledge that each step forward was a step on a razor's edge. "We've got enough to move on," Stephen finally said, his voice firm despite the churn of his thoughts. "It's time we pay the docks a visit." Evelyn nodded, her eyes reflecting the streetlights outside. "We do this right, and we might just crack this case wide open." Kingsley started the car, the engine's rumble a low growl in the quiet. "Then let's not waste any more time. The machinists won't wait for us." With the evidence gathered and their course set, the trio drove through the sleeping city. The wiretap's whispers, a sign of the confrontation to come. The legality of their actions hung in the balance, but their pursuit of the truth was unwavering. Chapter 10. The Unlikely Accomplice. The clock had just chimed midnight when Stephen, Kingsley, and Evelyn regrouped in the dimly lit backroom of a quiet diner that had become their unofficial headquarters. Detroit hummed outside, the city's pulse subdued yet relentless in the nocturnal hours. Each face around the rickety table bore the marks of fatigue, the weight of their clandestine endeavors etching deeper lines into their worried brows. Evelyn, her usually impeccable hair now a disheveled crown of auburn waves, slid a folder across the table toward Stephen. "This," she said, her voice a concoction of weariness and determination, "is what I found on the dock's manifests. It's not just shipments of machine parts." Stephen leafed through the papers, the text blurring until a name leapt out, stark against the white background. Benny. His loyal friend at the garage, whose easy smile and grease-stained hands had been a constant in Stephen's life. "Benny?" Stephen's voice faltered, a crack in his composed veneer. "He's listed as a consignee on several shipments." Kingsley's expression turned to stone, his hazel eyes narrowing. "That's a name I didn't expect to crop up in this mess." Evelyn watched the men carefully, her journalistic instincts sensing the seismic shift in the room. "It doesn't make sense." "Benny's been with you from the start, Stephen." Stephen's hands shook slightly as he tried to reconcile the Benny he knew with the name printed on the documents. "There has to be an explanation. He wouldn't what? Get involved in something over his head?" Kingsley's voice was gruff, the lines of his face deepening. "We've seen it before. The city has a way of pulling people into its dark currents. We need to confront him," Evelyn suggested, her gaze flicking between the two men. "Hear his side of the story." The diner's neon sign buzzed from outside the window, casting an eerie glow on the scene as they contemplated their next move. Trust, once an unspoken pact between them, now hung in the air, fragmented. The next day, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage, Stephen found Benny, his friend's usual jovial demeanor replaced with a tension that pulled at his features. "Benny," Stephen began, the folder from Evelyn clutched in his hands like a lifeline. "Your name's on some shipping manifests from the docks, consignments that don't look like car parts." Benny's brow furrowed, his gaze darting away before meeting Stephen's. "Steve, I can explain." "Then explain," Stephen urged, his heart thudding in his chest. "Because it looks like you're mixed up with the machinists." Benny leaned on a workbench, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I started moving parts for extra cash. But I didn't know who was behind it, I swear. It was just parts, Steve, nothing more." Stephen's mind raced, grappling with the image of his friend as an unwitting cog in the machinist's grand design. "You didn't know?" "No," Benny implored, his eyes earnest. "I thought it was odd, the secrecy, but the money was good. And I've got debt, Steve." "You know that." Kingsley, who'd been lingering in the shadows, stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "You need to tell us everything you know, Benny. Names, places, anything that can help us." Benny nodded, wiping his hands on a rag as if trying to rid himself of the grime of his choices. "I'll give you everything I got. I don't want no part of this no more." As the trio left the garage, the city's cacophony enveloping them, the delicate thread of trust that had been frayed was slowly, cautiously being rewoven. Their investigation had taken an unexpected turn, but the revelation of Benny's involvement had only served to unite them further in their pursuit of the truth. With Benny's knowledge added to their arsenal, they now had a clearer view of the machinists' labyrinthine operations. The web of conspiracy they sought to unravel had ensnared one of their own, but it had also provided them with the keys to unlocking the next door in their search for justice. Chapter 11: Betrayal at the Docks. The docks of Detroit, a sprawling canvas of containers and cranes, loomed over the river like silent sentinels. Stephen, Evelyn, and Kingsley maneuvered through the labyrinth of metal and concrete, the air pungent with the smell of brine and diesel. Moonlight glinted off the water, casting an eerie pall over the scene as they approached their designated meeting spot. "This doesn't sit right with me," Evelyn muttered, her eyes scanning the shadows. "It's too exposed." Razor said this is where the exchange would happen. Stephen replied, his hand resting on the cold steel of a shipping container. "If we want to catch them in the act, this is our chance." Kingsley's voice was a gravelly whisper. "Keep your wits about you. These men play for keeps." They found cover behind a stack of crates, the sound of lapping water against the docks playing counterpoint to their tense silence. Minutes stretched into hours as they waited for the signal, a flash of light from across the water that never came. Suddenly, a clamor erupted as a cadre of men emerged from the bowels of a freighter, their steps purposeful and menacing. Stephen tensed, realizing too late that the plan had unraveled. "It's a setup," Kingsley hissed, reaching for the revolver concealed beneath his coat. Stephen's pulse hammered in his ears as the men fanned out, searching. He exchanged a glance with Evelyn, who nodded, her face set in grim determination. They were cornered, but not defeated. A gruff voice echoed through the night. "Poole, come out, wherever you are." It was Razor's voice, dripping with malice. Stephen stepped from behind the crates, his demeanor calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Looking for me?" Razor's laugh was a harsh bark. "You think you can outsmart us? You're in over your head." Evelyn emerged beside Stephen, her posture defiant. "We know about the shipments, Razor. It's over." A cruel smile twisted Razor's lips as he gestured to his men. "You don't get it, do you? You're just pawns in a much bigger game." Without warning, the night erupted in chaos as Razor's men advanced. Stephen ducked as a fist swung towards his head, retaliating with a swift punch to his assailant's gut. Evelyn, her reflexes honed from years of investigative work, evaded another thug, using her momentum to send him sprawling. Kingsley, ever the veteran, drew his revolver, firing a warning shot that echoed like thunder. "Back off. This ends now." The standoff was a taut wire, ready to snap. It was Razor who broke first, a sneer on his lips as he backed away. "This isn't the end, Poole. You can't stop what's coming." With a swift motion from Razor, the docks plunged into darkness as the lights were extinguished. A symphony of splashes told Stephen that their adversaries were retreating by water, leaving them in the enveloping gloom. As their eyes adjusted, Stephen, Evelyn, and Kingsley regrouped, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "They're gone," Kingsley confirmed, holstering his weapon. Stephen leaned against a crate, his mind reeling. "They knew we were coming." Evelyn's gaze was steely. "They did, and that means we have a leak." The realization hung between them, a bitter taste in the night air. Trust, once unshakable, now trembled on uncertain ground. But as the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, painting the world in shades of gray, their resolve solidified once more. "We'll find the mole," Stephen vowed, his voice a low growl, "and we'll bring the machinists to their knees." The docks, once a place of industry and honest toil, had become the stage for their most perilous act yet. But as they left the scene, each step was a tribute to their unwavering pursuit of justice. The conspiracy had sought to claim them in its mechanized grip, but they would not be so easily ensnared. Chapter 12: The Forgotten Witness. The city's underbelly had a pulse of its own, a rhythm dictated by the forgotten and the overlooked. It was in one such neglected alleyway, where the refuse of urban life accumulated like forgotten memories, that Stephen stumbled upon an unexpected source. The man before him was an amalgamation of tattered clothing and grime, his hair a wild mane framing a face weathered by the elements and time. He sat perched atop an overturned crate, a kingdom of cardboard boxes and discarded bottles his throne. "Excuse me," Stephen called out to the man, his voice echoing slightly off the graffiti-stained walls. "I'm looking for information about an incident that occurred here a few nights ago." The man, whose piercing gaze belied his disheveled appearance, tilted his head, considering Stephen. "Incident?" he echoed, the word colored with the gravel of disuse. "Yes," Stephen affirmed. "There was an altercation involving some men from the docks." The man's eyes sharpened, a flicker of recognition dancing within their depths. Men with shadows trailing behind him. They think, 'cause I'm out here, I don't see, but I see plenty." Stephen knelt beside the man, offering a respectful nod. "Anything you can tell me would be a great help." A cryptic smile played upon the man's lips. They were passing round a package about the size of a bread box, actin' all secretive-like. Then they split like a tree struck by lightning when they done. Stephen's interest peaked. This was a detail they had missed. A package? Did you see what was inside? The man shook his head, his tangled locks swaying. "Nah, but it was important. That much was clear." They had a look in their eyes like hawks circling prey. "Did you catch any names? Anything distinctive?" Stephen probed, his mind racing with the implications. Not names, but one had a voice like shattered glass, rough and sharp. And there was a symbol. Stitched on his coat looked like a gear with an eyeball at the center. The machinist's symbol, it was a thread they were all too familiar with. Stephen's brow furrowed as he mulled over the information. "This is invaluable." "Thank you," the man waved a dismissive hand. "Just telling you what I seen." This alley sees more stories than most. Stephen stood, the gears of his mind turning with this new revelation. "If you remember anything else, I'll be around." As he walked back to the street, the encounter weighed on him. The team had been so focused on the figures moving in the light that they had neglected those who dwelled in the shadows, the witnesses to all things unseen. Meeting with Kingsley and Evelyn at a nearby diner, the scent of coffee and fried food enveloping them, Stephen relayed the man's tale. Evelyn's fingers tapped against her notepad, her brows knitted in concentration. "We've been looking at this all wrong. We need eyes and ears everywhere, not just where we expect trouble." Kingsley's eyes glinted with a tactical light. "The streets have their own network. Maybe it's time we tap into that." The forgotten witness had provided them with a new angle, a piece of the puzzle that had nearly slipped through the cracks. With this newfound perspective, the investigation veered onto a path less traveled, promising to unearth secrets that thrived in the city's hidden corners. The diner's clock ticked on, marking the passage of time as they discussed their next move. The mystery of the machinists deepened, but their resolve to illuminate the truth never wavered. The forgotten witness had been heard, and his words now formed a crucial piece in the tapestry of their search for answers. Chapter 13, Riddles in the Dark. In the heart of an abandoned factory, where the echo of prosperity had long since faded, Stephen, Evelyn, and Kingsley huddled around a cryptic note that had found its way into their hands, a riddle wrapped in the guise of poetry, hinting at a meeting of minds that held the city's fate in its grip. "The hawk soars at midnight, where metal beasts slumber, and the serpent's tongue whispers secrets," Stephen read aloud, his brow furrowed in concentration. The paper felt aged and fragile between his fingers, the ink a stark contrast against its yellowed surface. Evelyn leaned forward, her emerald eyes reflecting the scant light that filtered through the broken windows. "It's not just a riddle, it's an invitation." Metal beasts could mean the derelict cars in the old manufacturing plant on Lowry. Kingsley rubbed his stubbled chin thoughtfully. "And hawk, that's often code for a lookout. They were watching for something, or someone." "We'll need to be cautious," Stephen mused, folding the note carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket. "If we're right, we could be walking into the lion's den." The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the factory's graffiti-laden walls. The trio made their way to Lowry Street, the silence around them punctuated only by the distant sound of the city's nightlife beginning to stir. The old manufacturing plant loomed before them, its skeletal remains a monument to an era long past. The trio slipped through a gap in the fence, moving like phantoms among the carcasses of once great machines that littered the grounds. As the clock struck 12, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air settled over the group. Stephen's hand hovered near the concealed gun at his side, his senses alert for any sign of movement. A faint murmur of voices drew their attention to the plant's main assembly room. Peering from behind the rusted frame of a conveyor belt, they spotted a gathering of figures shrouded in dim light. The tone of the meeting was hushed but intense, the participants unaware of their silent audience. "You must be controlled," a voice hissed, the words slithering through the air. "The machinists cannot afford disruption," another, smoother voice countered. "The pieces are in place. The city will function like clockwork under our hand. We just need to keep the cogs turning." Kingsley's eyes met Stephen's, a silent exchange of understanding passing between them. These were the power players of the city, the ones pulling the strings from behind the curtain. Evelyn, her reporter's instinct kicking in, began to scribble notes in the dark, capturing every word, every nuance. This was more than a story. It was the blueprint of a conspiracy that had ensnared Detroit in its mechanical grip. As the meeting disbanded, the figures melting back into the shadows from whence they came, Stephen, Evelyn, and Kingsley retreated to the safety of the night. They had infiltrated the serpent's lair and emerged with the venomous truth. Back at the diner, now empty, save for a lone night shift worker idly wiping down the counter, the trio pored over Evelyn's notes. The riddle had led them to a revelation that shifted the very ground beneath their feet. "We've been chasing shadows," Stephen said, his voice a mixture of anger and awe. "But now we've got a clear view of the beast we're up against." Evelyn nodded, her eyes fierce. "And we're going to take it down, piece by piece." Kingsley, ever the pragmatist, folded his arms across his chest. "It won't be easy. They're entrenched, have been for years. But we've got something they don't." "And what's that?" Stephen asked. Kingsley's lips twitched in a semblance of a smile. "We've got the truth. And the truth is the wrench in the works that'll bring the whole damn machine crashing down." The night waned as they planned their next move, the diner's neon sign flickering outside like a lantern in the darkness. They had uncovered a layer of the conspiracy that many had suspected, but none had been able to prove. Now, armed with the truth and the tenacity that had brought them this far, they were ready to expose the Clockwork conspiracy and grind its gears to a halt. Chapter 14, The Maze of Motives. In the dimly lit back room of an all-night diner that had become their makeshift headquarters, Stephen, Evelyn, and Kingsley sat ensconced in a cocoon of urgency. Papers strewn across the table, each document a fragment of the larger enigma, they leaned into a rigorous analysis of the information bleeding ink onto the laminate surface. Stephen's fingers danced over a series of photos, tracing the lines that connected faces to places and places to power. Every time we think we reach close to the heart of it all, another layer surfaces. It's like peeling an onion with no core. Evelyn, her green eyes scanning a ledger with microscopic precision, nodded. It's a deliberate obfuscation. Every transaction here is clean on the surface, but it's the subtext, the pattern of the withdrawals, the timing that suggests otherwise. Kingsley, his gaze never leaving the map of Detroit pinned to the wall, marked with colored pins and strings, added, "They've turned the city into a chessboard, and they've been playing a grand game right under our noses." A waitress, her apron stained with the night's toll, shuffled over with a fresh pot of coffee, her presence a silent solace in the sea of convolution. After pouring a steaming cup for each of them, she left as quietly as she had arrived. Stephen took a sip, the bitterness of the coffee grounding him. We need to discern the pattern, anticipate their next move. There's a linchpin here that we're overlooking. Evelyn, flipping through the ledger, paused, tapping her finger against a page. "Here, this entry. It's coded, but it repeats always on the same date, every month. It's not a large sum, but it's consistent. Could be a payment, a retainer of sorts." Kingsley's voice held a gruff note of curiosity. "Who's on the receiving end?" Stephen leaned in, examining the entry. "The payee is always listed under a generic holding company. Could be a front, or it could be our linchpin," Evelyn interjected, the cogs of her mind visibly turning. "We trace this payment back to the source, and we might just untangle this web." The trio set about cross-referencing the company with public records, business registrations, and known associates of the machinists. The task was meticulous, requiring the patience of a hunter laying a trap. As the night waned into the ink-blue hues of pre-dawn, Stephen finally unearthed a connection. Got something. This company, its registered agent, is a well-known attorney, one who's had his fingers in a number of unsavory pies. Evelyn's posture straightened, the wariness momentarily banished by the adrenaline of a breakthrough. If he's the one dispersing the payments, he'll have records, ledger's proof. Kingsley stood, his frame casting a long shadow across the table. Then we need to pay him a visit, apply some pressure. He's the type to fold when the heat's turned up. Stephen agreed, his resolve solidifying. He's our next move. We squeeze him for information, and we might just find the center of this labyrinth. As they made their plans, the diner began to stir with the early murmurs of morning. Patrons trickled in, oblivious to the conspiracy being unraveled in their midst. The team, united in their singular purpose, prepared to confront the attorney, to chase down the thread they had uncovered in the hope it would unravel the machinist's grand design. The sun crept above the horizon, casting a soft glow through the diner's windows, as Stephen, Evelyn, and Kingsley stepped out into the new day. The maze of motives lay before them, daunting in its complexity. But with each revelation, they were drawing closer to the truth, ready to face whatever labyrinthine paths lay ahead. Chapter 15, The Disappearing Act. In the vestiges of twilight, the trio found themselves in the ramshackle office of an informant, a room as cluttered with secrets as it was with the detritus of clandestine enterprises. The informant, a lanky figure known as Twitch, was gone, his departure as sudden as it was silent. Evelyn rifled through the papers strewn across the desk, her keen reporter's gaze picking out irregularities in the chaos. "He knew we were coming," she said, her voice a mix of frustration and concern. "He wouldn't leave without a reason." Stephen paced the length of the cramped space, the worn floorboards creaking underfoot. Or he didn't have a choice. Somebody might have spooked him, or worse. Kingsley stood by the only window, the glass grimy and cracked, peering into the gloom of the city. "This bloke was our best shot at finding out who's pulling the strings. If he's ducked out, then he's carrying valuable intel with him." The urgency of their predicament was palpable, the air in the room growing thick with the tick-tock of the clock perched precariously on a stack of books. Time was the enemy now, slipping through their fingers like grains of sand. Evelyn, her auburn hair tied back to keep it from her face as she worked, paused, holding up a small dog-eared notebook. "I think I found something." Twitch was tracking movements, transactions, even had a few names circled. Stephen leaned over her shoulder, his eyes tracing the scribbles and notes. "Can you make out this address here? It's near the docks, isn't it?" "Looks like it," Kingsley confirmed, the cogs of his mind working overtime. "A warehouse, likely. Could be where he's headed." Without another word, the trio gathered their things and made for the door, the urgency of their mission lending speed to their steps. They navigated the labyrinth of Detroit's streets, the city's nocturnal heartbeat a backdrop to their silent resolve. The warehouse was a monolithic structure, its walls a patchwork of corrugated metal and peeling paint, standing sentinel over the dock's edge. The trio approached with caution, shadows cloaking their movements. "Keep your eyes peeled," Stephen whispered as they neared the entrance, his hand resting on the cool metal of the gun at his hip. "If Twitch is here, he won't be alone." Evelyn nodded, her journalistic instinct owned to a razor's edge. She had swapped her notepad for a compact camera, the lens a silent witness poised to capture the unfolding drama. The warehouse doors groaned as they inched them open, revealing a cavernous space dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. A maze of crates and containers awaited them, an attestation to the industry that never truly slept. They split up, each taking a different path through the maze, the air heavy with the scent of salt and machine oil. Stephen's footsteps were measured, his breathing controlled as he navigated the labyrinthine interior. A noise caught his attention, the scuff of a shoe on concrete. He paused, listening. There it was again, a soft echo in the vastness of the warehouse. He followed the sound, his senses alert. "Stephen," came Evelyn's hushed voice through the radio they each carried. "I found signs of someone living here. Clothes. Twitch has been here." Kingsley's voice crackled next, "East side's clear. I'm heading towards Mall." A sudden clamor cut him off. the sound of crashing and shouting breaking the tense quiet. Stephen broke into a run, his heart pounding as he followed the commotion. They converged on the source of the noise, finding Twitch cornered by a group of burly men, their faces grim masks of intent. The informant was wild-eyed, desperation etched into his every move. "Back off," Stephen barked, the authority of his former detective days infusing his voice with command. "Let him go." The men hesitated, sizing up the new arrivals. Stephen could see calculations running behind their eyes, weighing the odds. Evelyn stepped forward, her camera raised. "This is being documented. Any harm comes to him, and it's on you." The standoff was tense, a razor's edge of potential violence. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the men backed away, slinking into the shadows like wraiths. Twitch sagged with relief, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "You got here just in time," he panted. "They want what I know, what I've seen." Kingsley stepped up, his presence a solid reassurance. "Let's get you somewhere safe. You can tell us everything there." As they escorted Twitch out of the warehouse, the first light of dawn creeping across the sky, the pieces of the puzzle Twitch carried with him were like precious cargo. The conspiracy had tried to silence a key player, but Stephen and his allies had pulled off their own disappearing act, rescuing the informant from the clutches of an unseen enemy. Now, with Twitch's testimony, they hoped to unravel the web of the machinist's grand design further. But with every step forward, they knew the path would only grow more tangled, the stakes higher. Time was still against them, but so long as they had leads to follow, they would not stop. The truth, however complex and convoluted, was out there, and they were determined to bring it into the light. Chapter 16. The Face-Off. The door to Vincent's study creaked ominously as Stephen pushed it open, stepping into a room saturated with the scent of leather and the subtle tang of cigar smoke. Vincent, seated behind a mahogany desk that seemed more a fortress than a piece of furniture, looked up, his green eyes cold and calculating. "Stephen, to what do I owe the pleasure of this untimely visit?" Vincent's voice was smooth, each syllable a deliberate drop in the still pond of the tension-filled room. "Cut the pleasantries, Vincent. We both know why I'm here," Stephen said, his voice even, betraying none of the pounding of his heart. "It's time we put all the cards on the table." Vincent leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Cards on the table? I assure you, I'm not in the habit of revealing my hand so hastily." Stephen took a few steps forward, his gaze unwavering. "You've orchestrated quite the performance, but the final act is upon us. The machinist's order, the manipulations, the control over the city, it ends now." A mirthless chuckle escaped Vincent's lips as he regarded Stephen. "You see control, I see orchestration. A symphony requires a conductor, and this city thrives under my baton." "The city doesn't need a conductor," Stephen countered, his voice rising. "It needs the truth. People's lives aren't pawns in your game, they matter." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "You speak of truth as if it were a noble cause. Truth is a commodity, Stephen, and like all commodities, it's subject to the whims of those in power. Power doesn't grant you the right to play God," Stephen shot back. "Laura's death, the lives you've affected, it's a weight you'll have to bear." The mention of Laura struck a chord, a flicker of disturbance crossing Vincent's composed facade. "Laura was unfortunate collateral, a variable I didn't anticipate." "Collateral?" Stephen's fists clenched at his sides. "She was everything to me. You took her away, and for what? Your vision of order?" Vincent rose from his chair, his presence dominating the room. "Order is the bedrock of civilization. Without it, we descend into chaos, into the abyss of our own savagery." "Your order is a cage," Stephen declared, the room seeming to constrict around them, "and I will dismantle it, piece by piece if I have to." Vincent's eyes were chips of ice. "You think you have that power? You, a lone mechanic against an order that predates your very existence?" "A mechanic with the truth," Stephen retorted, "and allies who believe in a future free from your machinations." The standoff between them was a quiet storm, the air charged with the electricity of their wills clashing. It was a game of chess played not with pieces, but with the very fabric of their beliefs. Vincent's gaze was unyielding. "You're out of your depth. Leave now, and perhaps I'll allow you a modicum of peace." "I'm not going anywhere," Stephen said, his voice a steel thread. "Not until justice is served." For a moment, neither man moved, the steadiest stage where their battle of wits was fought in silence. Then Vincent sighed, a sound that seemed to echo in the grandeur of the room. "Very well, Stephen. You've made your choice." Vincent's voice was a whisper, yet it carried the weight of finality. But choices have consequences. As Stephen turned to leave, he knew that the confrontation was far from over. Vincent Moretti was a formidable opponent, but the stakes were too high to back down. The clock was ticking, and the game was reaching its zenith. The conspiracy had a name, a face, and now it had an adversary determined to see it crumble. Chapter 17, The Breakdown. The stale air of the safe house was thick with the anticipation of action. Stephen, Evelyn, and Kingsley gathered around a sprawl of photographs and documents that painted a damning portrait of Vincent's empire. The walls were plastered with timelines and connections, a visual cacophony of guilt and machination. "We've got enough to take this to the authorities," Stephen said, his voice a steady drumbeat against the silence. "Enough to send Vincent and his cronies away for a long time." Evelyn leaned over the table, her fingers tracing the web of evidence they had compiled. "It's not just about putting them behind bars. It's about dismantling the system they've put in place, making sure it can't be rebuilt." Kingsley's jaw was set, a covenant to the gravity of their undertaking. "We're going to need to be precise. Take out the supports, and the whole structure comes crashing down." They planned their moves carefully, a strategic advance on multiple fronts. As dawn broke, they split up, each tasked with a crucial part of the takedown. Stephen made his way to the police precinct, the weight of the evidence in his briefcase an anchor with every step. He presented the case to the captain, a man of grizzled experience and skeptical eye, who listened intently as the story unfolded. "This is a big claim, Stephen," the captain said once the tale had been told. "But if what you're saying is true, we've got a chance to clean up this city." Evelyn, meanwhile, had taken to the press, her articles a surgical knife cutting through the facade of philanthropy that Vincent had so carefully curated. The morning papers hit the streets with the force of a bombshell, the public outcry immediate and loud. Kingsley worked from the shadows, his old contacts within the city's underbelly proving invaluable. One by one, he found the weak links in Vincent's chain and applied pressure. Information flowed like a breached dam, each leak further eroding the empire's foundation. As the day turned to night, the trio reconvened, the safe house a sanctuary amidst the chaos they had unleashed. News reports flickered on the television screen, a stream of arrests and seizures, painting the picture of an empire in its death throes. "We've done it," Evelyn said, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "We've actually done it." "It's not over yet," Kingsley reminded her, his eyes on the screen. "Vincent won't go down without a fight, and he's still out there." Stephen nodded, knowing Kingsley was right. "We need to stay vigilant. This is when he's most dangerous, when he's cornered and desperate." The hours passed with the trio on high alert, the city outside the safe house a hive of activity as the last vestiges of the machinist's order were rooted out. Then, as midnight approached, word came through. Vincent had been found. Cornered in his mansion with nowhere to run, he had surrendered to the authorities without a shot fired. Stephen allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, a brief respite in the eye of the storm. "Laura's getting justice," he murmured, more to himself than to his companions. Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. "She is, Stephen. And the city, it's going to be a better place." Kingsley grunted, a sound that might have been agreement. "We've broken the clockwork, but we'll need to remain watchful. There are always more gears waiting to turn." The safe house seemed to exhale, the tension seeping from the walls as the reality of their victory settled in. The criminal empire that had cast a long shadow over Detroit was crumbling, its machinations halted by the unwavering pursuit of justice. The night grew quiet, the sounds of the city muffled and distant. In the breakdown of the machinist's empire, a new era was dawning, one that promised hope and the chance for renewal. But for Stephen, the battle had been deeply personal, and the victory was bittersweet. The empire had fallen, but it was the memory of Laura and the fight for the soul of the city that would endure. Chapter 18. The Cost of Justice. The dim glow of the street lamp outside cast long shadows across Stephen's workshop, where he, Evelyn, and Kingsley gathered amidst the silent testimony of tool chests and car parts. The weight of their journey hung in the air, a tangible presence amid the scent of oil and metal. Stephen leaned against the workbench, his hands smeared with grime, a physical manifestation of the turmoil within. "We've come full circle," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet. Vincent's behind bars, the orders dismantled, and yet Evelyn, perched on a stool, her notepad forgotten beside her, met his gaze. "And yet, we're no closer to understanding why Laura was taken from us." Kingsley stood by the doorway, his silhouette a stark contrast to the light filtering in. "We may never fully understand. Some men thrive on power, on the chaos they wield like a weapon. Laura was collateral in their eyes." Stephen's fist came down hard on the bench, the sound a sharp crack in the stillness. Collateral. She was so much more. She had dreams, a future. She deserved better. Evelyn reached out, her touch gentle on Stephen's arm. "She did. And we've honored her memory by shining a light on the darkness that took her. The city, it breathes a little easier now because of what we've done." Kingsley's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of experience. "The price of justice is often steep. We've paid in blood and tears, but we've also ensured that no one else will suffer at the hands of the machinists." Stephen straightened, his resolve hardening once more. "It's not enough. We need to make sure this never happens again, that no other shadows creep in to fill the void left by the machinists." "We will," Evelyn assured him, her conviction clear. "We've started something here, a movement of sorts. People are watching, listening. We can advocate for change, for a system that protects, not prays." "The machinists were a symptom of a larger disease," Kingsley added. "Corruption, greed. Their battles will continue to fight." Stephen nodded, a silent pact forming between them. "Then we keep fighting. We build on the legacy we've started, for Laura, for the city." They stood together, three figures united by loss and triumph, the scars of their ordeal etched into their very being. The workshop, once a place of simple labor, had become the crucible where their resolve had been forged. As dawn crept through the grimy windows, painting the room with hues of gold and amber, the team knew that their work was far from over. The conspiracy had been unraveled, but its threads were woven into the fabric of the city, waiting to be picked up by those who dared to follow. The cost of their pursuit was etched in their hearts, a bittersweet victory that would shape their paths forever. But they had emerged from the fire stronger, ready to face whatever new challenges awaited. The truth behind Laura's murder had been a painful revelation, a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of humanity. Yet in its wake, they found a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice had extracted its toll, but it had also given them a cause to rally behind, a mission that transcended their own personal grief. The cost of justice was high, but the value of the peace it brought was priceless. Chapter 19. The pendulum swings. The gentle chime of the clock hanging above the garage's office door marked the passing of the hour, a reminder of time's relentless march. Stephen sat behind the desk, once cluttered with parts and manuals, now displaying the neatly organized files of the machinist's case. The scent of oil and grease, once overpowering, had become a comforting undercurrent to the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Evelyn entered, her stride confident yet considerate, a slight smile on her face. "I never thought I'd see the day this place would double as an investigator's office." Stephen looked up, his eyes carrying the subtle signs of sleepless nights and reflective thoughts. "It's been a sanctuary in its own right, a place to piece together more than just engines." "You've done good, Stephen," Evelyn said as she settled into the chair across from him. "We both know the cost was high, but the city, it's breathing again, free from the machinist's stranglehold." Stephen nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had endured. "It's strange, though. For so long, the goal was to tear down the empire, to find justice. Now that it's done, I find myself at a crossroads." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes reflecting empathy. "It's the nature of change, isn't it? The end of one chapter is just the beginning of another. You've been given a chance to redefine your future." He sighed, the sound a release of pent-up tension. "I keep thinking about Laura. She was the catalyst for all of this. In seeking justice for her, I lost sight of the man she loved. The man she loved is still here," Evelyn reassured him. He's just been through the crucible, is all. You've emerged with a clarity you didn't have before. That's something to hold on to. Kingsley's voice, gruff yet warm, filled the room as he entered. Clarity is worth its weight in gold in times like these. You've got a clear view of what needs to be done. Stephen met Kingsley's gaze, a sense of camaraderie passing between them. The work isn't finished. The machinists were a symptom, not the disease itself. The city needs vigilant guardians to keep the darkness at bay. That's the spirit, Kingsley said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The fight for justice doesn't end, it just evolves. Evelyn stood, her silhouette framed by the light streaming through the office window. And what about you, Stephen? What does your evolution look like from here? Stephen paused, considering the question that had occupied his thoughts. I think I'll rebuild this place. Make it a hub for those who need help, who can't get it from the usual channels. A place where justice isn't just a word, but a promise. Kingsley nodded, a look of approval etched into his weathered features. A noble cause. And you won't be doing it alone. Evelyn smiled, picking up her camera. And I'll document it. Show the city that out of the ashes, hope can rise. That from pain, purpose can be found. The clock chimed again, marking the start of a new hour, a new beginning. The pendulum swung steadily, a reminder that time would continue its march, but also that with each swing, there was an opportunity to act, to change, to make a difference. As Stephen stood and joined his friends at the door, ready to face the world beyond the garage, he realized the journey had transformed him. The scars he bore were badges of honor, symbols of a battle hard won. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a guardian of the city, a seeker of truth, a man with a newfound purpose. The door closed behind them, the sound a gentle punctuation to the end of one journey and the quiet prelude to the next. The machinist conspiracy had been unraveled, and in its place, a new chapter awaited, filled with the promise of redemption and the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt on the foundations of justice and resolve.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe now and visit our website, StoryWave.ai, to start creating your own generative audiobooks today. StoryWave is the only true on-demand entertainment portal.